Hello again. This morning I'd just like to talk a little bit about compassion, because I don't think we fully understand it. We think it's an emotional thing that you have to work up, but I just want to bring a scripture now which will, I think, highlight it a little bit. It's from Exodus 2, verse 5. And the daughter of Pharaoh came down to wash herself at the river, and her maidens walked along by the riverside. And when she saw the ark among the flags, she sent her maid to fetch it. And when she'd opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the babe wept. And she had compassion on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrew children." Funny how things happen, isn't it? That little child in the basket was Moses, because the Egyptian princess heard him cry and had compassion on him. His life was spared from certain death. She saw his need and felt the call to help, so spontaneously made an unpremeditated decision and ended up doing something completely unexpected. She didn't love the child. She'd had no relationship with it until that very moment, but she'll surely receive her reward for what she did. Morris and I, we haven't been called to evangelism. Morris often says that he doesn't lose sleep at night crying about lost souls. Actually, his heart cries for those in the church who call themselves Christians and yet live just like the world, because he's a teacher, not an evangelist. These Christians have the same worldview as unbelievers. They listen to the same music, participate in the same activities, talk the same talk, walk the same walk, and have the same lifestyle as the very people who oppose God. And Morris yearns to teach them the difference between Christianity, the religion, and discipleship, which is the need to be separate and holy for God's purposes. Morris knows his calling, and so never accepts invitations to preach the gospel, only to teach. So it was quite amazing to be fervently asked by an elderly Indian pastor to visit his church in Andhra Pradesh and teach the ministers whom he had trained. This man, Pastor Samuel, was surrounded by Hindu fanatics and faced much persecution, but pleaded with Morris for help in this area. We'd already made a promise to God that if asked to teach and not preach, we'd go wherever we were invited in the world, so we gave him our word. Now, ministering to people in the third world was not what we had envisaged doing. It was certainly not something that appealed to either of us. Nothing really prepares you for the incessant heat and putrid stench of those dusty roads. You can't get away from it. But God was very kind, as our host knew how to look after Westerners. We were provided with an air-conditioned accommodation, which had a fridge and a Western toilet, and these were such a blessing. Samuel apologised for the fact he didn't have running hot water for us to shower, but we stressed over and over again how grateful we were for the cold water which hit us every day, and we truly meant it. When we come across people who are poor, we tend to think that they are also uneducated and simple. But I saw for myself the tremendous hunger these people had for the Word of God. They soaked up everything Morris had to teach them. They wrote pages and pages of notes because they wanted to make sure they remembered these teachings so that they could pass them on to their own congregations. It was wonderful to minister to these church leaders. And it's no wonder Jesus told John the Baptist's disciples to tell John that the poor had the gospel preached unto them. As we fellowshipped and shared meals with and warmly hugged these untouchables, our hearts opened up, and both Morris and I learned to truly love and appreciate them. Their simplicity was so refreshing. God notices and cares about poor people, even though others with better social status often ignore and abuse them. Samuel shared with us his longing for a Bible school so that he could properly train his ministers, and we could see for ourselves that this was a real need. Although we had no money ourselves, we felt we did have a voice, so promised to support him in his venture. We came home to England with a burden for these Indian pastors. We'd felt some compassion. Sometime after our trip to India, we were contacted by a man from Nigeria. We'd received many invitations from that country and asking us to preach the gospel and hold mass crusades. But this was different. For some time, apparently, this Nigerian brother had been translating the bi-monthly newsletters we published back then into local dialects. He was duplicating and sending them out to neighbouring countries at his own expense. Now, because of this, he was asking if he could call himself Barratt Ministries Nigeria and be our representative. We felt we couldn't permit this unless we'd met him personally, so made arrangements to pay him a visit. We said we wouldn't stay in a hotel or guest house. We would very much like him to accommodate us in his home. We didn't say so, but really, we wanted to vet him. Well, the plane landed in Lagos, and Barratt rejoiced when he saw us at the airport. He and his family were so happy to have us in their car with them. What first hit us was the oppressive heat plus the roads, or should I say potholes, connected with a bit of tarmac. The ride was terribly bumpy and took ages because we had to go so slow to avoid the suspension completely collapsing. But it was when we turned off the main roads and began to drive down the dirt tracks that I really began to fear. I looked at the tiny shacks that we passed to the right and to the left, and I wondered where on earth we were being taken. Barratt lived in the poor district so that he could help those with needs. He actually had a good job and could live in a nice area, but this was what he felt Christianity was about, so he was putting his faith into practice. Well, I thank God from the bottom of my heart when we arrived at his home, for he lived in a brick building which had a Western toilet. What a blessing. No running water. We had to fill the tank every time we wanted to flush the loo, but we didn't have to find a hole somewhere outside. Barratt gave Maurice and I his family bed, and he and his family slept on the floor in the living area. They had worn-out furniture and a thin carpet which had been given to them before being thrown out by people that Barratt was working for. They even had a fridge and an overhead fan. But as their share of electricity was only 1 or 2 hours per day due to power sharing, we didn't manage to enjoy the benefit of these luxuries very much. When the electricity went off, the main room was lit by a tiny little single torch bulb which had been rigged up to a battery. Because our friends were black, all we could see was the whites of their eyes and their teeth when they smiled, so we kept them happy. When we moved to other rooms, we had to take a torch with us. Yet Barratt and his family felt so blessed because God had given them things that others around them didn't have. And they did what they could to relieve the suffering of their neighbours by giving them food and other aids. What we hadn't been aware of was that Barratt had been really glad of this opportunity to host us, as he had wanted to see if we lived what we preached. He'd wanted to vet us. It was good to hear that we'd passed the test. Nikki, Barratt's wife, even went so far as to say that we'd been far less trouble than her own family, and apparently that was praise indeed. Well, as Barratt was a police detective, a year prior to our visit, he'd been sent to investigate some riots which had taken place in Kaduna, that's in the north of Nigeria. There had been some terrible tragedies when militant Muslims had persecuted Christians. Churches had been destroyed, and many pastors and believers had been killed or badly mutilated. A youth choir had been practicing in one of the church buildings when the Muslims had locked the doors and set fire to the place. They'd all been burned alive. Barratt saw the results of the massacre and had been burdened to help the children who had seen their parents butchered. As it happened, we'd already seen video footage of what had taken place because a missionary had asked us to help him make a film of this actual incident, so we had a keen interest. Barratt had a strong desire to build an orphanage in Lagos for these traumatised children, where it was safe from Muslim persecution, and we decided to help him realise his dream. We felt compassion. We came home to England with yet another burden and got a friend to draw up plans for the proposed orphanage, put out the word that we needed financial aid, and the project got underway. Well, the very next year, we were approached by Frank, a young pastor from Uganda, who wanted Maurice to teach discipleship to ministers from local churches. We again responded positively to the request and told Frank we would like to be accommodated in his home during our visit. Well, unfortunately, he said his house was too small and nobody in his church had room either. He booked us into a modest bed and breakfast guest house and came each day, sometimes 2 to 3 hours before we were due to leave for the meetings, just so that he could listen to us and glean as much as possible whilst he had the opportunity. He was hungry, not only for spiritual food, but he was very thin and very hungry for natural food. I wasn't used to eating breakfast, so I would pack up the things I would have eaten in serviettes and pass them on to him. He took these home to his family. Well, one day he invited us to his house to meet his family and share a meal with them. His wife Stella was pregnant with her first child, as they'd only been married 18 months, and was cooking our food out on the tiny porch using a little camping stove. She didn't have a kitchen. Indeed, she didn't have a lot of things. Frank's house comprised just 2 rooms, the lounge and the bedroom. No bathroom, toilet or kitchen. But he felt very blessed indeed because the house was made of brick, which meant that it was watertight in the rainy season and rat-free. We sat on the sofa in his lounge and his wife brought our food. Then a little group of black children gathered around and stared at us as we began to eat. I thought that these were the children from the neighbourhood who'd been inquisitive and come in to stare at our white faces as they'd never seen them before. But I was amazed to learn that all these children lived with Frank. His wife had taken them under her wing and was already supporting them before she was married. So now Frank had inherited them when he took on his new wife. He'd taken in 10 orphans. Their parents had either died from AIDS or were too poor to feed them. I was astounded. "Where do they all sleep?" I asked. He just moved his hands around in a gesture to say, "Anywhere." They weren't particular. Wherever there was space, that's where they slept. You know, this was so new to me. In the West, we give to the poor from our excess. But here, they were helping the poor because they had experienced poverty themselves and knew what it was like. Frank was so thin. Everyone knew pastors were amongst the poorest of the poor and didn't earn much money. Yet his heart couldn't refuse to help when asked, even though he was in such a desperate situation himself. Maurice and I knew we had to help. We had no money of our own, as we also were in the ministry, but we had friends and a voice and opportunities to make our voice heard. We promised Frank that we would do what we could to help, and God enabled us to raise funds to build him a temporary halfway house, which was twice as big as the house we visited. We then began to build an orphanage right next door to the halfway house. We don't even own our own house, but a need was staring us in the face and we couldn't ignore it. It became a call. Some time ago, I was talking with a policewoman who shared with me some of the everyday problems she has to deal with in her job as she walks the beat. She was telling me how she listens to some very tragic stories and witnesses some awful things. But at the end of the day, she can put it all behind her. And when she leaves the police station, she also leaves the worries of the day behind her. They're professional worries, not personal ones. Often, we can become hard to the heart cries of other people. Seeing so many desperate needs on the television has in fact desensitized us to the horrors of what they experience, because they're just shadows on a screen which we can shut off by pressing a button. They're not really our concern. Surrocat could have felt the same way about the children up in Kaduna. Frank could have felt the same way about the orphaned children left to fend for themselves on the streets. But somehow, God had given them a revelation of the needs of others, which ended up as a call for help. If your heart is open, you can guarantee that God will fill it, often to overflowing. It can be very painful sharing someone else's problem, but a problem shared is a problem halved, and your care could be the means of lightening someone else's very heavy load. We all need compassion. But it's not so hard to get compassion as we think. James 2 verse 15 says this: if a brother or sister be naked and destitute of daily food, and one of you say unto them, depart in peace, be warmed and filled, but ye give them not those things which are needful to the body, what does it profit? What good is that? 1 John 3 verse 17, but whosoever has this world's good and sees his brother have need, and shuts up his bowels of compassion from him, how dwells the love of God in him? My little children, let us not love in word, neither in tongue, but in deed and in truth. And here's a really serious exhortation to be more considerate and unselfish towards others, because it's going to matter very much to us personally when Jesus returns to judge the church. This is a portion from Matthew 25, starting at verse 31. When the Son of Man shall come in his glory, and all the holy angels with him, then shall he sit upon the throne of his glory. And before him shall be gathered all nations, and he shall separate them one from another, as a shepherd divides his sheep from the goats. And he shall set the sheep on his right hand, but the goats on the left. Then shall the king say unto them on his right hand, come, you blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me meat. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you took me in. Naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came unto me. Then shall the righteous answer him, saying, Lord, when saw we you hungry and fed you, or thirsty and gave you drink? When saw we you a stranger and took you in, or naked and clothed you? Or when saw we you sick or in prison and came unto you? And the king shall answer and say unto them, verily I say unto you, inasmuch as you have done it unto the least of these my brethren, notice he keeps saying my brethren, you have done it unto me. Then shall he say unto them on the left hand, depart from me, you cursed, into everlasting fire, prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me no meat. I was thirsty, and you gave me no drink. I was a stranger, and you took me not in. Naked, and you clothed me not. Sick, and in prison, and you visited me not. Then shall they also answer him, saying, Lord, when saw we you hungry, or thirsty, or a stranger, or naked, or sick, or in prison, and did not minister unto you? Then shall he answer them, saying, verily I say unto you, inasmuch as you did it not to one of the least of these, you did it not to me. And these shall go away into everlasting punishment, but the righteous into a life eternal. One last scripture. 1 Peter 3 verse 8. Finally, be you all of one mind, having compassion one of another. Love as brethren. Be pitiful. Be courteous. Not rendering evil for evil or railing for evil, but contrariwise, blessing, knowing that you are called thereunto, that you should inherit a blessing. Yes, there's a blessing to be inherited when you have compassion towards others worse off than yourself, particularly towards your brothers and sisters who are fellow believers. Don't rob yourself of a blessing by being callous and hard-hearted. God is no man's debtor, and when Jesus returns, you will certainly receive your reward. So God bless you.